The gold band slipped from Judith's trembling fingers onto the pawnbroker's scarred counter, with a soft clink that seemed to echo through her hollow chest like a funeral bell. She could not meet Silas Grimm's watery eyes as he examined the ring under his magnifying glass, turning it this way and that, in the dusty afternoon light filtering through the grimy window of his shop on Washington Boulevard in Ogden, Utah. It was September 1883, and the autumn air carried the first hints of the brutal winter to come down from the Wasatch Mountains. "Sterling silver with a thin gold wash," Grimm muttered, his yellowed teeth visible through his sparse beard. "Not much to it, Mrs. Crawford. I can give you 50 cents. Judith's breath caught in her throat. 50 cents would buy exactly what she needed, nothing more. A pint of milk for Thomas, her 3-year-old son who had been crying from hunger all morning. Her husband Robert had been dead for 6 months now, killed in a mining accident up in the mountains, and the meager savings they had accumulated had dwindled to nothing. The small house Robert had built with his own hands on the eastern edge of town was all she had left, and she had already sold everything of value except this ring. "That will be sufficient," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her pride had long since been ground to dust under the wheel of necessity. Grimm counted out the coins with deliberate slowness, dropping them one by one into her calloused palm. Judith closed her fingers around them quickly and turned toward the door, not wanting to spend another moment in the stifling shop that smelled of tobacco and desperation. The afternoon sun seemed too bright after the darkness of Grimm's establishment. Judith blinked against it, tucking the coins into the small cloth purse she kept tied at her waist. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, had faded to a nondescript gray, and she had mended it so many times that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. At 24 years old, she felt ancient, worn down by grief and poverty until she barely recognized the girl she had been when Robert had slipped that ring onto her finger 5 years ago. The general store was 3 blocks away. Judith walked quickly, keeping her eyes down, acutely aware of the looks she received from the townspeople. Some held pity, others held judgment. A young widow with a small child was either an object of charity or suspicion, depending on who was looking. She had learned to avoid eye contact, to make herself as invisible as possible. Thomas was with Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor who watched him when Judith had to venture into town. The arrangement was temporary, held together by Mrs. Henderson's kindness and Judith's increasingly desperate promises to repay her once circumstances improved. But circumstances showed no signs of improving. There was no work for a woman with no particular skills and a young child to care for. She had tried taking in laundry, but there were too many women offering the same service, and the competition drove prices down to almost nothing. The general store was busy with afternoon customers, ranchers and their wives stocking up on supplies. Judith waited her turn at the counter, conscious of how her shabby appearance contrasted with the relatively prosperous patrons around her. When the clerk finally turned to her, she asked quietly for a pint of milk. "That will be 50 cents, he said, and she placed the coins on the counter, watching as he carefully measured out the milk into the glass jar she had brought with her. Every drop was precious, would keep Thomas fed for another 2 days if she was careful with it. She was tucking the jar carefully into her basket when she heard the shop door open behind her and felt a shift in the atmosphere, the way a room changes when someone significant enters it. Judith glanced over her shoulder and saw a tall man in dusty range clothes, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to physical labor and open spaces, and when he removed his hat, She saw sun-bronzed features and dark hair that needed cutting. He could not have been much older than 30. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Judith felt an unexpected jolt run through her, something she had not felt since Robert's death. She looked away quickly, clutching her basket, and hurried toward the door. There was no room in her life for such thoughts. Survival was all that mattered now. The walk back to her house seemed longer than usual, her legs heavy with exhaustion. She had not eaten properly in days, giving most of her food to Thomas. The world sometimes swam before her eyes, and she had to stop periodically to catch her breath. But she made it home eventually, to the small wooden structure that Robert had built in the shadow of the mountains, with its tiny garden plot that had mostly failed this year due to her inability to tend it properly while worrying about keeping them fed. Mrs. Henderson met her at the door, Thomas clinging to the elderly woman's skirts. His face lit up when he saw his mother, and Judith felt her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. He was so small, so dependent on her, and she was failing him. "Mama!" he cried, rushing to her. She set down the basket and scooped him up, feeling the lightness of him, the way his small bones pressed against her through his clothes. "I have milk, my darling," she murmured against his hair. "Good fresh milk." Mrs. Henderson watched them with sympathetic eyes. "You look done in, child. Let me help you get him settled." But Judith shook her head. She could not impose any further on the old woman's kindness. "You have done more than enough. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I will manage from here." After the neighbor had left, Judith poured Thomas a small cup of milk and watched as he drank it eagerly, white droplets clinging to his upper lip. She wiped them away tenderly, fighting back the burning sensation behind her eyes that threatened tears. She could not afford to cry. Tears were a luxury for people who had the energy to spare. That evening, after she had settled Thomas into bed in the small room they now shared since she had sold the furniture from the other bedroom, Judith sat in the gathering darkness and stared at her bare left hand. The pale band of skin where the ring had been seemed to glow in the dimness. She pressed her right thumb against it, as if she could somehow press the ring back into existence through sheer will. Robert had bought that ring with his first month's wages from the mine. It had not been expensive, but he had been so proud when he gave it to her, his blue eyes shining with hope for their future together. They were going to build a good life in Ogden, he had promised. The town was growing, the railroad was coming through, there would be opportunities. And for a while, it had seemed like his dreams might come true. They had been happy, scraping by but happy, and then Thomas had been born and their joy had seemed complete. Then the mine collapse. 23 men dead, buried under tons of rock and earth. The mining company had paid out a pittance to the widows, barely enough to cover burial costs. Judith had used the money to buy a headstone for Robert's grave and had nothing left. She must have fallen asleep in the chair, because she woke with a start to the sound of Thomas crying. The room was completely dark now, and she stumbled toward his bed, disoriented. He was having another nightmare, calling for his father. Judith gathered him into her arms and rocked him, singing the lullaby she had sung to him since infancy, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Hush now, sweet boy. Mama is here. You are safe." It took a long time for him to settle back to sleep. By then, the moon had risen, casting silver light through the small window. Judith remained sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her son's peaceful face, and wondered how much longer she could keep this up. How much longer before her body simply gave out? How much longer before she could not even afford 50 cents for milk? She must have dozed again, because the next thing she knew, pale dawn light was creeping into the room. Thomas was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Judith rose stiffly, her back aching from the awkward position she had slept in, and went to check their supplies. There was a little cornmeal left, enough for a thin porridge, some dried beans, the milk, nothing else. She would have to find work somehow, today. There was no more putting it off, no more hoping something would turn up. She would have to beg for employment, would have to take anything offered no matter how degrading or poorly paid. But first, she needed to give Thomas his breakfast. She was building up the fire in the small stove when she heard a soft sound outside, like something being set down on the wooden step. Judith froze, listening. It was barely past dawn, too early for visitors. Her heart began to pound with an irrational fear. In her desperate state, everything seemed threatening. She waited several minutes but heard nothing more. Finally, curiosity overcame caution and she crept to the door, easing it open just a crack. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. There was no one in sight, but there on the step, catching the first rays of sunlight, was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Judith glanced around nervously, then quickly snatched up the bundle and retreated inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the cloth on the table. Inside was her wedding ring, the gold band gleaming as if it had been polished. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Judith unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, masculine, the letters formed with care. A woman's wedding ring should not be the price of her child's sustenance. I hope you will accept its return with no obligation. The town needs good people, and it is clear you are one of them. If you are in need of work, the Thornton Ranch is hiring for household help. Inquire with Thomas Thornton at the ranch, 5 miles northeast of town. There was no signature, no name. Judith read the note 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. Someone had bought back her ring from Grimm and returned it to her. Not just returned it, but done so anonymously, with no expectation of thanks or repayment. And they had offered information about potential employment. She sank into the chair, the ring clutched in her fist, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to cry. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, releasing months of held-back grief and fear and exhaustion. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was empty and clean and somehow lighter than she had been before. Thomas woke to find his mother sitting at the table with red-rimmed eyes but a strange, soft expression on her face. She made him his porridge and gave him more milk, and then she did something she had not done in a long time. She smiled. "How would you like to go on an adventure today?" She asked him. His eyes widened with excitement. "An adventure?" "Yes, my darling. We are going to visit a ranch." The Thornton Ranch was indeed 5 miles northeast of town, and Judith walked the distance with Thomas perched on her hip for the last 2 miles when his small legs grew tired. The September morning was beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue above the golden-brown landscape. In the distance, the Wasatch Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with snow. Judith had washed and mended her dress as best she could, had pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, and had slipped her wedding ring back onto her finger where it belonged. The weight of it felt right, felt like a piece of herself had been restored, but her mind was full of questions. Who had done this? And why? The ranch came into view gradually, first just a cluster of buildings in the distance, then resolving into a substantial operation with a large main house, several barns, extensive corrals and pastures dotted with cattle and horses. It was clearly a prosperous concern, and Judith felt her courage falter. What could she possibly offer such an establishment? She had no references, no experience beyond managing her own small household. But Thomas needed to eat, and she had walked 5 miles. She could at least inquire. A cowhand directed her to the main house, a well-built structure with a wide porch and real glass windows. Judith climbed the steps with Thomas's hand firmly in hers and knocked on the solid wooden door. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who opened the door was the same man she had seen in the general store the previous afternoon. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and that there were lines around them from squinting into the sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with strong hands and a direct gaze that made her want to look away but somehow could not. Recognition flashed in his eyes as well, and something else, something softer. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, and his voice was deep and quiet. "I hoped you would come." Judith's breath caught. You were the one who—" He nodded, stepping back to allow her entrance. "Thomas Thornton, please come inside." The interior of the house was surprisingly clean and well appointed, though it had the slightly bare look of a place inhabited only by men. Judith stood uncertainly in the entrance hall, very aware of her shabby appearance in contrast to the solid prosperity around her. "How did you know my name?" she asked, finding her voice. "Small town," he said simply. "Everyone knows everyone's business, whether they want to or not. I heard about your situation. When I saw you in the store yesterday and then saw your ring in Grimm's shop window afterward, I put the pieces together." He looked down at Thomas, who was staring up at him with wide eyes. "This must be your son." "Thomas," Judith said softly. "He is 3. Something flickered across Thornton's face. "Named after his father?" "No, after my father. He died before Thomas was born. My husband's name was Robert." An awkward silence fell between them. Thornton seemed to struggle with what to say next, and Judith realized that, despite his confident bearing, he was actually quite uncomfortable with social niceties. There was something endearing about it. "The note mentioned work," she said finally, because someone had to break the silence, and because she desperately needed to steer the conversation back to practical matters. "Yes," he said, seeming relieved. "I do need help with the household. I can manage the ranch well enough, but the house is beyond me. I need someone to cook, clean, manage supplies, that sort of thing. The position comes with room and board for you and your son, and wages of $10 a month." $10 a month was more than generous for such work. Judith stared at him suspiciously. "Why would you offer so much to a stranger?" He met her gaze directly. "Because it is worth that much to me to have it done properly, and because I can afford to pay fair wages." He paused. "And perhaps because I think you have had enough of people taking advantage of your circumstances." There was something in his tone, a hint of personal understanding, that made Judith wonder what his own story was. But she was in no position to be curious about the lives of others. She had her own survival to worry about. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "Today, if you are willing. There are 2 spare bedrooms on the 2nd floor. You and your son can take the larger one. I will have one of the hands bring your belongings from your house in town. I should go back and pack properly. Mrs. Crawford." His voice was gentle but firm. "Let me help you, please. You have walked 5 miles this morning and you look like you have not had a proper meal in weeks. Let my men handle your belongings. You can direct them on what to bring. In the meantime, let me make you and your son some breakfast." The offer was so kind, so unexpected, that Judith felt tears threaten again. She blinked them back fiercely. "I do not need charity, Mr. Thornton. This is not charity. This is an employer providing for his employee. There is a difference." He moved toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "Come, I am actually a decent cook when I put my mind to it." The kitchen was large and functional, with a good stove and solid work surfaces. Thornton moved around it with easy familiarity, pulling out eggs and bread and butter. He built up the fire in the stove and set a pan to heating, his movements economical and practiced. "You are not exaggerating about your cooking skills," Judith observed, watching him crack eggs one-handed into the pan. "I have been living alone for 5 years," he said. "A man learns to cook or he starves." He glanced at her. "There is coffee on the back of the stove if you want some. Cups in that cabinet." Judith poured herself coffee and gave Thomas a cup of water, then sat at the kitchen table and simply watched as Thornton prepared breakfast. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. Yesterday, she had been pawning her wedding ring for milk. Today, she was sitting in a prosperous rancher's kitchen watching him cook her breakfast. "Why did you buy back my ring?" she asked suddenly. His back was to her, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "It seemed wrong," he said after a moment. "A wedding ring should not be currency." "It should be. Sacred, I suppose. A symbol of something permanent in a world where so much is temporary. You speak like a man who understands the value of such symbols." "I do." He turned, sliding a plate of perfectly cooked eggs and toast in front of her, then a smaller portion for Thomas. "My parents were married for 40 years before my father died. My mother passed 6 months later. They were buried wearing their wedding rings. I am sorry for your loss. It was several years ago." He prepared his own plate and sat across from her. "This ranch was theirs. I inherited it when they died, came back from Colorado where I had been working cattle to run it. It has been a lonely sort of existence, if I am being honest." Judith cut Thomas's food into small pieces, then took a bite of her own. The eggs were fluffy and perfectly seasoned, the toast crisp and golden. It was the best meal she had eaten in months, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to not betray just how hungry she truly was. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Thomas, emboldened by the food and the kind stranger, began to chatter about a bird he had seen on the walk to the ranch. Thornton listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Thomas beam with importance. Watching them interact, Judith felt something inside her begin to thaw, some frozen part of her heart that she had locked away when Robert died. It was dangerous, this thawing. It made her vulnerable. But she also realized she was too tired to maintain her walls any longer. She needed help, and this man was offering it with no apparent strings attached. She would have to trust that his intentions were as honorable as they seemed. After breakfast, Thornton showed them to the bedroom that would be theirs. It was spacious and clean, with a large bed covered in a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and even a small writing desk by the window that looked out over the ranch yard. There was a second, smaller bed in the corner that would be perfect for Thomas. "My mother's sewing room," Thornton explained. "She passed before she could finish all her projects. I have not had the heart to clear it out properly, but if you want to remove anything, feel free." "It is perfect," Judith said honestly. "More than perfect. Thank you, Mr. Thornton." "Thomas," he said, "please. We are going to be living in the same house. Formality seems excessive." "Then you should call me Judith." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, made him look younger and more approachable. "Judith, it suits you." Over the next few days, Judith settled into a routine at the ranch. She woke early each morning, built up the fires, and prepared breakfast for Thomas Thornton and the hands who worked for him. There were 3 permanent employees, all older men who had worked for Thornton's father and stayed on after his death. They were respectful and kept their distance, understanding without being told that Judith was not available for the kind of attention that a young widow sometimes attracted. After breakfast, she cleaned the house, which was substantial work given its size and the fact that it had been neglected for some time. She found mouse nests in corners and cobwebs in every crevice, but she attacked the work methodically, one room at a time. Thomas played quietly nearby or helped in his small way, carrying rags or fetching water. In the afternoons, she prepared the evening meal and managed the household accounts. Thornton gave her a budget for supplies and trusted her to spend it wisely. She found herself taking pride in stretching the money as far as possible, finding bargains in town, and putting her neglected garden skills to work in the kitchen plot behind the house. Thornton himself was often out working the ranch during the day, but he always returned for the evening meal. He would wash up at the pump outside, change into clean clothes, and sit down at the table with an air of satisfaction that suggested these domestic comforts meant a great deal to him. He was not an effusive man, but he always thanked her for the meal and often complimented specific dishes. In the evenings after Thomas was asleep, Judith would sometimes find Thornton sitting on the porch, looking out over his land. At first she left him alone, understanding the need for solitude. But gradually, as days turned to weeks, she began to join him there. They would sit in companionable silence, or sometimes talk quietly about inconsequential things. The weather, the ranch operations, news from town. It was a month after she had arrived that Thornton finally asked about her husband. They were sitting on the porch as usual, the October night air crisp and cool. The stars overhead were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights. Judith had brought her mending outside, working by the light of a lantern Thornton had hung for her. "What was he like?" Thornton asked. "Your husband." Judith's needle stilled. She had grown comfortable enough with Thornton that the question did not feel invasive, but it still took her a moment to answer. "He was kind," she said finally. "Very kind and optimistic. He always believed things would work out for the best, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. He worked hard and loved his family. He was a good man. You must miss him terribly. I do, but not in the way I once did." She looked up from her mending, meeting Thornton's eyes. "At first the grief was crushing. I could barely function. But time passes and the sharp edges wear smooth. Now I miss him the way you might miss a beautiful season that has passed, with fondness, but also with acceptance that it is gone." Thornton nodded slowly. "I think that is a healthy way to grieve. Some people never let go. They hold on so tight to what was that they cannot see what is." "And what is?" Judith asked softly. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. But he turned away, looking back out at the darkness. "Another chance," he said. "A possibility, if one is brave enough to take it." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words. Judith felt her heart beating faster, felt the awareness of him as more than just an employer, more than just a kind man who had helped her in her time of need. She was aware of him as a man, and herself as a woman and the possibility that lay between them, but it was too soon, too fast. She was not ready, despite the thawing she felt happening inside her. So she went back to her mending, and Thornton continued staring out at the night, and the moment passed. November came cold and sharp, with snow flurries that danced across the ranch yard and piled in drifts against the barn walls. Judith threw herself into preparing the house for winter, checking the seals on windows, ensuring there was adequate firewood, preserving vegetables from the kitchen garden before the hard freeze set in. Thomas was thriving. The regular meals and stable environment had transformed him from a wan, listless child into a rosy-cheeked boy full of energy and curiosity. He followed Thornton around whenever possible, asking endless questions about the horses and cattle and the workings of the ranch. Thornton bore the attention with remarkable patience, taking time to answer questions, and even fashioning a small wooden horse for the boy to play with. Watching them together did something to Judith's heart. She saw how gentle Thornton was with her son, how he never dismissed or ignored him, and she found herself imagining what it would be like if this were a permanent arrangement. If Thomas could grow up with a father figure, if she could have a partner to share the burdens of life. But those were dangerous thoughts, and she tried to push them away. Thornton had given no indication that he saw her as anything more than an employee, despite that one charged moment on the porch. He was kind and respectful, but he maintained a certain distance. Perhaps he was simply a good man who helped those in need. Perhaps she was reading too much into simple human decency, because she was lonely and grateful. The first real snow came in mid-November, a blizzard that howled down from the mountains and buried the ranch under 2 feet of heavy, wet snow. For 3 days, they were all trapped inside, the world outside reduced to a white blur beyond the windows. The hands stayed in the bunkhouse, venturing out only to tend to the animals in the barn. Thornton, Judith, and Thomas were isolated in the main house, a small family unit whether they intended to be or not. On the second day of the storm, Thomas came down with a fever. One moment he was playing with his wooden horse, the next he was flushed and listless, his small body radiating heat. Judith's heart seized with terror. She had no medical supplies beyond the basics, and the doctor was 5 miles away in town. Unreachable in the storm, Thornton found her in Thomas's room, sponging the boy's forehead with cool water, her face pale and her hands shaking. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. "I do not know. He is so hot and he is not fully conscious. Thomas, can you hear Mama?" She patted his cheek gently, but the boy only moaned and turned his head away. "Let me see." Thornton knelt by the bed, placing his large hand on Thomas's forehead, then checking his pulse. "He is burning up, but his heartbeat is strong. Do you have willow bark for the fever?" "I have nothing. I have been meaning to restock the medicine cabinet, but I have not gotten to it yet. I have some in my room. My mother kept a well-stocked supply for emergencies. I will get it." He returned with a wooden box full of small bottles and packets. Together, they prepared a willow bark tea and managed to get some of it down Thomas's throat. Then there was nothing to do but wait and keep him cool. Judith refused to leave his side. She sat by the bed, refreshing the cool compresses on his forehead, offering sips of water when he would take them, and praying silently to a God she was no longer sure was listening. Thornton stayed with her, keeping the fire going, bringing food she could not eat, offering quiet reassurance. "He is strong," he said during the long night when Thomas's fever seemed to peak and Judith was nearly mad with fear. "Children spike high fevers. It is frightening, but often they break quickly. He will come through this." "You cannot know that," Judith whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I have already lost so much. I cannot lose him too. I cannot." Thornton moved closer, and then his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest. She stiffened for just a moment, then collapsed into him, sobbing into his shirt. He held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort that she barely heard but that soothed nonetheless. "I am here," he said. "You are not alone. Whatever happens, I am here." Judith clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. She had been alone for so long, carrying everything by herself, that the relief of sharing this burden was almost as overwhelming as the fear. She cried until she had no tears left, and still he held her, patient and steady. Toward dawn, Thomas's fever broke. The color returned to his face, his breathing eased, and when Judith touched his forehead, it was blessedly cool. She let out a shaking sob of relief, and Thornton smiled, his own expression showing the strain of the long night. "I told you he was strong," he said softly. Thomas woke properly later that morning, weak but aware, asking for water and toast. Judith fed him carefully, watching his every expression for signs of relapse, but he seemed to be genuinely recovering. By afternoon he was asking for his wooden horse, and Judith knew the crisis had passed. She finally allowed herself to sleep then, curling up on top of the covers next to Thomas, her hand on his chest so she could feel him breathing. When she woke, it was late afternoon and Thornton was sitting in the chair by the window, watching them both with an expression she could not quite read. "You should have woken me," she said, sitting up groggily. "You have work to do, you did not need to stay." "The work can wait. I wanted to make sure you were both all right." He stood, stretching. "The storm has passed. The hands are digging out now, but there is no rush. Rest as long as you need." "Thomas, She paused, unsure how to express what she felt. "Thank you for last night, for staying with me. I do not think I could have managed alone." He moved closer to the bed, looking down at her with those deep brown eyes. "You have been managing alone for a long time, Judith. Too long. You do not have to anymore." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Judith felt her pulse quicken, felt the awareness that had been building between them crystallize into something solid and real. This was not just gratitude she felt for him. It was something deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified her. "Thomas." She began, but he shook his head. "Not now. You are exhausted and your son needs you, but soon, when things are calm, we need to talk. There are things I want to say to you." He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Judith sat in the quiet room, listening to her son's steady breathing, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. The days after the storm were busy ones, with snow to clear and damage to repair. One of the barn roofs had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, and 2 of the cattle had gotten out through a downed fence and had to be tracked and retrieved. Thornton was occupied from dawn to dusk with the work, and Judith barely saw him except at meals. But the tension between them remained, a living thing that charged the air whenever they were in the same room. Judith found herself hyper-aware of his presence, noticing details she had not attended to before. The way his hair curled slightly at his nape, the small scar on his left hand. The way his eyes crinkled when Thomas made him laugh. She thought about the feel of his arms around her, the strength and warmth of him, and had to remind herself sternly that she was his employee, nothing more. Except she was beginning to suspect she was something more, or at least that he wanted her to be. The conversation he had promised finally came on a Sunday afternoon in late November. The weather had cleared to a brilliant cold day, the snow sparkling under the sun. Thomas was napping, worn out from playing in the snow that morning. Thornton found Judith in the kitchen, preparing bread dough for the week ahead. "Come outside with me for a minute," he said. "There is something I want to show you." She wiped her floury hands on her apron and followed him out to the barn. The hands had the afternoon off, so the ranch was quiet. Thornton led her to one of the stalls where a beautiful sorrel mare stood munching hay. "This is Copper," he said, stroking the horse's nose. "She was my mother's favorite. I have been keeping her exercised, but she needs more attention than I can give her. She is a gentle creature, perfect for someone learning to ride." Judith looked at him questioningly. "Are you suggesting I learn to ride?" "I am suggesting a great many things." He turned to face her, leaning back against the stall door. The filtered light coming through the barn's high windows cast interesting shadows across his face. "I have been trying to find the right words for weeks now, and I keep coming up empty. So I am just going to speak plainly and hope you do not think me a fool." Judith's heart began to pound. "I could never think you a fool. Do not be so sure." He took a deep breath. "When I saw you in the general store that day, saw the sadness in your eyes and the way you held yourself like you were trying to disappear, something in me recognized something in you. I have been lonely, Judith, for years. This ranch is successful. I have everything a man could want materially, but I have been lonely. And then you came here, and suddenly my house felt like a home again." He pushed away from the stall door, moving closer to her. "I know it has only been 2 months. I know you are still grieving your husband. I know this is probably too soon and too fast. But I need you to know that my feelings for you are not those of an employer for an employee. They are the feelings of a man for a woman he is coming to care for deeply." Judith stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to tell him it was indeed too soon, that she was not ready, that she needed more time. But another part of her, the part that had been slowly waking up over these past weeks, wanted nothing more than to step into his arms and tell him she felt the same way. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "I am confused and frightened and I think I am feeling things I should not feel yet. Robert has only been gone 6 months. There is no timeline for healing," Thornton said gently, "and I am not asking you to forget him or to stop grieving. I would never ask that. I am simply asking if, in time, you think you might be able to care for me the way I am beginning to care for you." "I think I already do," Judith whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. "And that terrifies me. What if it is too soon? What if I am simply latching onto you because you saved me when I was desperate? What if I am confusing gratitude with something else?" Thornton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. "Then we take our time and figure it out together. I am not going anywhere, Judith. Whether you come to care for me or not, you and Thomas have a home here as long as you want it." She looked down at their joined hands, at her wedding ring gleaming against her skin. "I do not know how to do this. How to move forward. I feel guilty even thinking about it." "Would Robert want you to spend the rest of your life alone?" he asked quietly. The question hit her like a physical blow because she knew the answer. Robert, with his kind heart and optimistic nature, would have been horrified at the idea of her suffering on his account. He would have wanted her to be happy, to find love again, to give Thomas a father. "No," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "He would want me to be happy. He would want Thomas to have a good life. He would probably be grateful to you for helping us. Then perhaps you can let go of the guilt and just allow yourself to feel what you feel. No expectations, no pressure, just possibility." Judith looked up at him, at his honest, open face, and felt something inside her shift and settle. She had been so focused on survival, on just getting through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to hope for something more. But standing here in the quiet barn with this good man holding her hand, she felt hope flicker to life inside her like a candle flame. "I would like that," she said softly. "Possibility." His face broke into a smile that transformed him, made him almost boyishly handsome. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "Good. That is very good. Now, would you like to meet Copper properly? I meant what I said about teaching you to ride. It would give you more freedom, the ability to go into town on your own when you need to." They spent the next hour with the horse, Thornton explaining the basics of riding, showing her how to saddle and bridle Copper, letting her get comfortable with the animal's size and strength. Judith found herself laughing as Copper nuzzled her pockets looking for treats, the sound strange and wonderful after so many months of sorrow. When they returned to the house, Thomas was awake and demanding his mother's attention. But as Judith went about her afternoon tasks, preparing dinner and tending to her son, she caught Thornton watching her several times with an expression of such tender affection that it made her stomach flutter. That night, after Thomas was asleep, they sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, and talked for hours. Thornton told her about his childhood on the ranch, about his parents' love story, about the years he had spent working as a cowhand in Colorado before returning to take over the family property. Judith told him about her own childhood in a small farming community in Iowa, about meeting Robert at a church social, about their decision to head west for a better life. "You regret it?" Thornton asked. "Coming west?" Judith considered the question carefully. "I regret Robert's death. I regret that Thomas will not know his father, but I do not regret coming here, no. This is where my life is now. For better or worse, I am a Western woman." "For better, I think," Thornton said softly, and Judith felt her cheeks flush with pleasure. December arrived with more snow and bitterly cold temperatures. The ranch settled into the quiet rhythms of winter, with the cattle brought closer to the barns for feeding, and the horses kept stabled except for necessary exercise. Judith learned to ride, bundled in layers of wool and leather, with Thornton leading Copper on a long line until she felt confident enough to manage on her own. It was cold, hard work, and her muscles ached from the unfamiliar exercise, but she loved it. Loved the feeling of freedom it gave her, the sense of competence and independence. Thornton watched her progress with pride, praising her when she managed something difficult and encouraging her when she grew frustrated. "You are a natural horsewoman," he told her one afternoon as she successfully completed her first solo circuit of the corral. "Another few weeks and you will be ready to ride out with me." "I would like that," Judith said, meaning more than just the riding. Their relationship continued to deepen through December and into January. They had not kissed, had barely touched beyond that one embrace during Thomas's illness, but the emotional intimacy between them was profound. They talked about everything, their dreams and fears, their pasts and possible futures. Thornton shared his hopes for the ranch, his plans to expand the herd and perhaps branch into horse breeding. Judith spoke of her desire to see Thomas educated, to give him opportunities neither she nor Robert had enjoyed. "He could go to university," Thornton said one evening. "If that is what he wants, I would support that." The casual way he included himself in Thomas's future made Judith's heart swell. He was not just talking about her son's education. He was talking about being part of their lives long term, about being a father to Thomas. Christmas came quietly. Judith baked special treats and made small gifts for everyone on the ranch. Thornton surprised her with a beautiful wool cloak in deep blue, lined with fleece, that fit her perfectly and must have cost a small fortune. He gave Thomas a child-sized saddle and announced that he had a pony in mind that would be perfect for a boy learning to ride. On Christmas night, after Thomas had finally fallen asleep clutching a carved wooden train Thornton had made for him, Judith found Thornton standing by the window in the parlor, looking out at the snow-covered landscape illuminated by moonlight. "Thank you for making this a real Christmas," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I did not think we would have another happy holiday after Robert died, but today was wonderful." "It was wonderful because you were here," he said, turning to look at her. "You and Thomas. You have made this house a home, Judith. You have brought light and warmth and laughter to a place that was very dark and empty." She looked up at him, at his dear, familiar face, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. She had been holding back, waiting for some sign that she was ready, that enough time had passed. But she realized that readiness was not something that happened to you. It was something you chose. "Thomas," she said softly, then corrected herself. "Thomas, I care for you very much. More than I thought I could care for anyone again. And I think I am ready to stop being afraid and to start looking forward instead of backward." His eyes widened slightly, and then he was cupping her face in his hands, looking at her with such intensity that she felt it all the way to her toes. "Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, Judith Crawford, I am not going to want to stop. I am going to want to court you properly and marry you and spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Then kiss me," she whispered. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, but Judith rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met softly at first, tentative, exploratory. But then Thornton made a low sound in his throat and pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, and Judith felt herself melt into him, her arms winding around his neck. It was nothing like kissing Robert, and she was glad. This was new, different, its own experience. Thornton tasted of cinnamon from the cider they had drunk with dinner, and he kissed like a man who had been starving for affection. Judith gave as good as she got, pouring months of suppressed loneliness and longing into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thornton rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon to ask properly, but marry me, Judith. Be my wife. Let me be a father to Thomas. Let us build a life together." Judith's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "Give me a few more months to be sure to know that this is right. But if you ask me then, I think my answer will be yes." He smiled, that wonderful, transforming smile that made him look younger. "Then I will ask you in the spring, and I will spend every day between now and then showing you that this is right, that we are right." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it. When they finally pulled apart, Judith felt lighter than she had in over a year. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but it no longer defined her. She was not just Robert's widow, not just a woman struggling to survive. She was Judith, a woman with a future, a woman who was choosing to love again. January and February passed in a blur of cold weather and quiet happiness. Thornton courted her openly now, bringing her small gifts, stealing kisses when Thomas was not looking, holding her hand as they sat by the fire in the evenings. The hands noticed the change in their relationship and approved, one of the older men going so far as to tell Judith that he had never seen the boss so happy. Judith continued to manage the household, but now there was a lightness to her work, a joy in making the house beautiful for someone she loved. She sewed new curtains for the parlor, replanted the kitchen garden with early spring vegetables, and began tentatively adding her own touches to the decor, replacing some of the heavier masculine pieces with lighter, more feminine items. Thornton encouraged every change, delighted to see her making the place her own. "It is your home," he would say. "Make it however you want it." In March, on a day when the sun shone brightly and the first hints of spring were visible in the greening grass and budding trees, Thornton took Judith and Thomas on a picnic to a meadow on the far edge of the ranch property. They rode out together, Thomas perched in front of Thornton on his big bay gelding, Judith managing Copper competently on her own. The meadow was beautiful, sheltered by a ring of cottonwood trees with a small creek running through it. Early wildflowers dotted the grass, and birds sang in the branches overhead. They spread out a blanket and ate the lunch Judith had packed, Thomas running around collecting interesting rocks and sticks while the adults watched indulgently. After they had eaten, Thornton stood and offered his hand to Judith. "Walk with me," he said. They left Thomas playing by the creek, within sight but out of earshot, and walked to the far end of the meadow where a single large cottonwood stood. Thornton pulled Judith into the shade of its branches and took both her hands in his. "It is spring," he said simply. Judith's heart began to race. "It is. I told you I would ask you again in the spring, so I am asking. Judith Crawford, will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Let me be a father to Thomas, and build a life with me here on this ranch." She looked up at him, at this good, kind, patient man who had saved her when she had nothing, who had given her time to heal, who had shown her that it was possible to love again without betraying the memory of the love that came before. Her answer had been certain for weeks, but she had waited for this moment for spring and new beginnings. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Thomas Thornton, I will marry you." He let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, thoroughly, and she kissed him back with equal passion. "When?" he asked when they finally came up for air. "How soon can we do this?" "As soon as you like," Judith said, happiness bubbling through her veins like champagne. "Tomorrow, if you want." "Tomorrow might be rushing it," he said with a laugh. "But soon, very soon. I have waited long enough for you." They told Thomas on the ride back to the ranch, explaining that Thornton would be his new father, that they would be a family. Thomas, who already adored Thornton, accepted the news with a child's easy adaptability, immediately asking if he could call Thornton Papa. Thornton's eyes went suspiciously bright as he agreed, and Judith saw him swallow hard against emotion. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Ogden, attended by the ranch hands and a few townspeople who had become friends. Judith wore a new dress in pale green that Thornton had commissioned from the town seamstress, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers. She wore her original wedding ring, the gold band that had started this whole chain of events, and Thornton slipped a matching gold band onto his own finger during the ceremony. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Thornton kissed her, it felt like a promise of all the good things to come. Thomas stood beside them, holding his mother's free hand, and when the kiss ended, Thornton scooped the boy up and held him between them, making it clear that this was a marriage of 3, a family formed from loss and found again in love. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, the spring air warm and sweet with the scent of new grass and blooming sage. The hands had decorated the porch with ribbons and flowers, a simple but touching gesture that made Judith's eyes sting with happy tears. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the house was quiet, Thornton carried Judith over the threshold of what was now their bedroom, the master bedroom that had belonged to his parents and that he had been sleeping in alone for 5 years. He set her down gently and looked at her with so much love that it took her breath away. "I never thought I would have this," he said softly. "A wife, a family, someone to share my life with. And then you walked into my life and everything changed." "You saved me," Judith said, reaching up to cup his cheek. "In every way a person can be saved. You gave me back my dignity, my hope, my future. You gave Thomas a father. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again." "We saved each other," he corrected, turning his head to kiss her palm. "I was existing, not living. You taught me the difference." They came together then with tenderness and passion, 2 people who had been lonely finding solace and joy in each other. Outside, the spring wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of summer and all the seasons beyond. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Thornton handling the livestock and land while Judith managed the household finances and expanded their operations into horse breeding as they had discussed. They worked well together, partners in every sense of the word. Thomas thrived, growing from a small, shy boy into a confident young man who loved the ranch life. Thornton taught him everything about working cattle and horses, and the bond between them was as strong as any biological father and son. Thomas never forgot Robert, his biological father, but he loved Thornton with his whole heart, and Thornton returned that love with fierce devotion. 2 years after their marriage, Judith gave birth to a son they named Robert Thomas, honoring both her first husband and her second. The baby had Thornton's dark hair and Judith's blue eyes, and Thomas was over the moon to have a little brother. Thornton held his newborn son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he marveled at the tiny, perfect life they had created together. "Thank you," he whispered to Judith as she lay exhausted but happy in their bed. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me everything." 3 years later, a daughter arrived, and they named her Elizabeth May after both their mothers. She had Judith's dark hair and Thornton's brown eyes, and a spirit that was entirely her own from the very beginning. The house rang with laughter and children's voices, and the loneliness that had once defined it was a distant memory. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thornton and Judith rode out to the meadow where he had proposed, leaving the children in the capable hands of Thomas, now a responsible teenager. They spread out a blanket in the shade of the same cottonwood tree and lay back, looking up at the spring sky through the green leaves. "You ever regret it?" Thornton asked, taking her hand. "Marrying me so soon after Robert's death?" "I know some people thought it was scandalous, you remarrying within a year." Judith turned to look at him, at his beloved face that was now as familiar to her as her own. "Not for one single moment. You gave me my life back, Thomas. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You gave Thomas a father and our other children a wonderful home. How could I regret any of that? I just want you to be happy," he said. "That has always been my only goal. I am happy," she said firmly. "Incredibly, wonderfully happy. And I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." He pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had shown on their wedding night 10 years earlier. "I love you too. More every day, if that is possible." They lay in each other's arms, listening to the creek burble and the birds sing, and Judith thought about the journey that had brought her here. The crushing poverty and desperation that had led her to pawn her wedding ring. The mysterious kindness of a stranger who had bought it back and returned it. The slow building of trust and affection that had grown into deep, abiding love. Sometimes she thought about what would have happened if Thornton had not seen her in the general store that day, if he had not been moved to buy back her ring, if he had not offered her employment and a new beginning. She would probably be dead by now, or worse, separated from Thomas and living in some charity institution. Instead, she was here, prosperous and loved with a family and a future. "What are you thinking about?" Thornton asked, stroking her hair. "About how one act of kindness can change everything," she said. "About how you saved my life with a simple gesture." "It was not so simple," he admitted. "I knew what I was doing when I bought that ring. I saw you in the store, saw how beautiful and sad you were, and something in me said, pay attention to this woman. When I saw the ring in Grimm's window an hour later, it seemed like fate. I knew I had to return it to you, knew I had to find a way to help you." "Love at first sight," Judith teased. "Maybe," he said seriously. "Or maybe just recognition. Like I had been waiting for you my whole life and just did not know it until I saw you." Judith's throat tightened with emotion. "I am so grateful I pawned that ring. I know that sounds strange, but if I had not been so desperate, if I had not been at my absolute lowest point, I never would have met you. You never would have known I needed help." "Everything happens for a reason," Thornton said. "Even the painful things. They brought us together, and for that, I would not change anything." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, their hands linked between their horses. As the house came into view, Judith could see the children playing in the yard, Thomas supervising the younger two. Smoke rose from the chimney and the windows glowed with lamplight. It looked like what it was, a home full of love and life. That night, after the children were asleep, Judith stood at her bedroom window looking out at the ranch she now called home. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, the same ring that had been the symbol of her first marriage, and then the currency of her desperation. and finally the gift that had brought her and Thornton together. She touched it gently, thinking of Robert and how he would have been pleased to know she had found happiness again. Thinking of Thornton and the patient, devoted love he had shown her. Thinking of her children, sleeping peacefully in their beds, safe and loved and full of promise. Behind her, she heard Thornton enter the room, felt his arms slide around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Come to bed," he murmured against her hair. "In a moment," she said, leaning back against him. "I am just appreciating what we have built together." "We have built something good," he agreed. "Something lasting. Our children will grow up knowing they are loved and safe. They will never know the kind of desperation you faced. We will make sure of that." "Yes," Judith agreed. "We will make sure of that." They stood together at the window for a few more moments, looking out at their land, their home, their life. Then Judith turned in her husband's arms and kissed him, deep and long, full of passion and gratitude and love that had only grown stronger with time. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew to manhood and took on more responsibility at the ranch, eventually marrying a sweet-natured girl from town and building his own house on the ranch property. He and his wife gave Judith and Thornton their first grandchildren, beautiful babies that filled the main house with life whenever they visited. Robert Thomas followed his older brother into ranch work, but he also showed an aptitude for breeding and training horses that surpassed anyone in the family. He expanded that branch of their operations, developing a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from across the territory. He married later than Thomas had, to a strong-willed woman who could ride as well as any man and who shared his passion for horses. Elizabeth May was the wild card, the child who did not quite fit the mold. She loved the ranch but dreamed of education and travel. Thornton and Judith supported her ambitions, sending her to a boarding school in Salt Lake City, and then to a women's college back east. She returned every summer, bringing with her stories of a wider world but always glad to come home to the mountains and the land she loved. Eventually, she married a lawyer and settled in Ogden, close enough to visit often with her own children. Through it all, Judith and Thornton's love remained the foundation of the family. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and sun and hard work. But the way Thornton looked at Judith never changed, and the way she smiled at him remained as warm as it had been on their wedding day. On their 25th wedding anniversary, they held a large celebration at the ranch. All three of their children were there with their spouses and children. The Hands, both old and new, joined in the festivities. Even some townspeople came out to celebrate the couple who had become pillars of the community. As the sun set and the party continued, Judith and Thornton slipped away from the crowd to walk to their favorite spot by the cottonwood tree. It had become a tradition over the years, visiting this place where their married life had truly begun. 25 years, Judith marveled, settling onto the blanket Thornton had brought. It seems impossible that so much time has passed. "The best 25 years of my life," Thornton said, sitting beside her and pulling her close. "Every day with you has been a gift, even the hard days," Judith teased, "because there have been some of those. Especially the hard days," he said seriously. "Because we faced them together, and they made us stronger. That is what partnership is, Judith, not just sharing the good times but weathering the storms together." She laid her head on his shoulder, comfortable and content. "I never imagined when I walked into that pawn shop with my wedding ring that my life would turn out like this. I thought I was at the end of my story. Instead, I was just at the beginning of a new chapter." "The best chapter," Thornton said, kissing the top of her head, "and it is not over yet. We have many more years ahead of us, God willing." They did have more years, many of them. They saw all their children settled and happy, saw their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in Utah. Thornton and Judith eventually handed over the day-to-day management to their sons, but they remained active and engaged, the beloved patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family. When they were both in their 70s, Thornton fell ill with a fever that would not break. Judith nursed him day and night, refusing to leave his side, just as he had once sat with her during Thomas's childhood illness. But this time, the crisis did not pass. Thornton grew weaker, and they both knew the end was coming. On his last day, surrounded by his wife and children and grandchildren, Thornton held Judith's hand and looked at her with eyes that were still as full of love as they had been 40 years earlier. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saying yes, for giving me a family, for loving me." "Thank you for seeing me," Judith said, tears streaming down her face, "for buying back my ring, for giving me a chance at happiness when I thought all hope was lost. Best 50 cents I ever spent," he said with a weak smile, and then his eyes closed for the last time. Judith buried him next to his parents in the family cemetery on the ranch. She stood at his grave in her black dress, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and said goodbye to the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. But she did not fall apart as she had when Robert died. She grieved deeply, but she also knew that Thornton would want her to continue living, to continue being part of the family they had built together. So she dried her tears and went on, spending her remaining years watching over her family, passing on the stories of how it all began to the youngest generation. She told them about the ring, about the mysterious cowboy who had bought it back and left it on her step, about the kindness that had changed everything. She made sure they understood that one act of compassion could ripple out across generations, that goodness begets goodness, and that love, real love, was worth whatever sacrifices it required. Judith lived to be 83 years old, a grand old lady revered by her sprawling family. On her last day, surrounded by more descendants than she could count, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. They buried her next to Thornton, reuniting them in death as they had been in life. On her finger was the gold band that had been at the center of their story, the ring that had been a symbol of 2 marriages and the bridge between them. Her children decided it should be buried with her, a fitting end to its journey. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, a testament to what 2 people could build when they chose love over loneliness, hope over despair, and partnership over isolation. The story of Judith and Thornton became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and at family gatherings, a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments are just before the dawn of something beautiful. And in a small pawn shop in Ogden, now long gone and replaced by modern buildings, the ghost of a moment remained. The moment when a desperate young widow pawned her most precious possession for milk for her son. The moment when a lonely cowboy saw a ring in a window and recognized an opportunity to change a life. The moment when kindness and need collided to create something lasting and true. Because that is how the best love stories begin. Not with grand gestures or perfect timing, but with one person seeing another's pain and choosing to act. With compassion offered and accepted. With courage to try again even when hurt and fear say it is too risky. Judith and Thornton's story was proof that second chances exist, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the thing you think you have lost forever is simply waiting to be returned to you in a new and unexpected way. Their legacy lived on in the family they created, in the ranch they built, and in the memory of a gold band pawned in desperation and returned with love, bringing two lonely souls together and giving them everything they never dared to hope for. And so the story ends, not with sorrow but with celebration. A celebration of love found and family built and a life well lived. A celebration of the power of kindness and the resilience of the human heart. A celebration of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. The ring, buried with Judith, remained on her finger as she returned to the earth beside her beloved husband. And if gold could hold memories, that small band would have contained an entire lifetime of love, laughter, tears, and triumph. It would have held the memory of a young bride's joy, a desperate mother's sacrifice, a kind stranger's gift, and an enduring partnership that showed that sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in unlikely packages. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to tell the story, making sure each new generation understood where they came from and what their family was built on. Not just land and cattle and prosperity, but on love and kindness and the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Judith and Thornton were together again, perhaps sitting under a cottonwood tree by a spring-fed creek, holding hands and watching over the family they created with such devotion. Their love story, which began with 50 cents and a gold ring in a pawn shop window, had become the foundation of something much larger than themselves. It had become legacy, legend, and most importantly, a reminder that no matter how dark things seem, there is always hope for a new beginning.